Perfect. So yeah, this webinar is being recorded. We do share the recording online on the Remedial Action Plan website. It normally takes a few days for us to process the video and upload it. So for folks who maybe can't join us for the full time, or if you want to share the recording of this presentation with folks that you know, keep an eye out on our website, which link to that video will be emailed to you in the follow-up email following this presentation. So even though we sort of find ourselves geographically dispersed today, meeting here in this online environment, I do want to begin by recognizing that we all work, live, and gather on traditional Indigenous territory. Toronto and Region Conservation respectfully acknowledges that the lands that we are situated on are the traditional territories and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Through our work with land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, TRCA appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. We're also really grateful for the continued work of many Indigenous peoples who are the original caretakers of this land, and we humbly acknowledge our responsibility to respect Indigenous perspectives and elevate Indigenous voices. And so, everyone is coming from different places. We invite you to acknowledge the territories and treaty lands in your local area in the chat. And we also encourage you to take some time to explore the interactive map at native-land.ca if you would like to learn more. And with that, I'll throw things back over to you, Don.
Mute myself. Thanks, Tisha. So as we usually do with these events, we will kick things off with just a couple of poll questions just to see if folks have attended Lake Ontario evenings before, and also to see how familiar folks are with the remedial action plan. So Tisha, if you don't mind bringing up our questions. Okay, so there's our poll questions. So the first question, is this your first time attending a Lake Ontario evening? And the second, are you familiar with the Toronto Region Remedial Action Plan? So we'll give folks about 10 seconds or so to answer that. And then Tisha, I don't know if you want to do just a countdown when we close these.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll give everyone maybe 5 more seconds.
Perfect.
5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
Okay, perfect. So pretty much a 50-50 split on both questions there. So great to see that we have many returning participants. So welcome back. Also great to see that we have folks joining tonight for the first time. So one of the goals of these events is to spread the word on the remedial action plan. So it's great to have some newcomers. And for those who are joining us for the first time, I will provide just a quick introduction to the remedial action plan, what it is, how it came to be, and how we're working towards a healthier lake in Toronto waterfront. So the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan, it came out of a process that started in the late 1980s when Toronto was identified by the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes as one of 43 areas of concern in Canada and the US. So areas of concern were defined as areas where the local environmental degradation posed a threat to the Great Lakes at large. So each of these areas of concern was measured up against 14 potential uses that could be impaired, called beneficial use impairments. And in Toronto, 11 of the 14 were attributed, and originally 8 of these were deemed impaired and 3 required further assessment, as this slide is illustrating. So the goal of the remedial action plan is to address these impairments and to ultimately delist Toronto as an area of concern. And the BUI, or beneficial use impairment, that we'll be focusing on tonight is the restrictions on fish consumption BUI, which is currently defined as impaired. So the remedial action plan, or also called the RAP, is a unique plan for each AOC, which identifies actions that have been or are to be implemented by RAP partners in order to address each of the remaining impairments. And in Toronto, we've made great progress in the last 30 years by working with partners to implement actions that improve water quality, aesthetics, create and restore fish and wildlife habitats and populations. And as a result, 5 of our original beneficial uses are no longer impaired, and progress has been made on the remaining 6. So some examples of these actions include sewer and wastewater treatment plant upgrades, aquatic and terrestrial habitat restoration across the area of concern, including 44 aquatic habitat sites guided by the Toronto Waterfront Aquatic Habitat Restoration Strategy, implementation of beach management plans, litter cleanups, a variety of outreach and education activities, and also tracking of contaminants levels in fish for safe consumption, which we'll learn more about tonight. So if you'd like to learn more about these or other RAP projects, or you'd like to view our work plan to see how we plan on delisting, you can visit our website at torontorap.ca. You can follow us on Twitter at @rap_Toronto, or you can email me directly using the address on the screen. So that concludes my brief introduction to the remedial action plan. So without further ado, we'll get into our talks tonight. So our first speaker tonight is Jean Coffin-Schmidt, a PhD candidate at Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment under Dr. Catherine Fiorella. Jean's dissertation research is investigating motivations and perceptions around the use of wild and backyard foods in New York, in part in collaboration with Vivian Wynn from Carleton University. She is also an early career research fellow with the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission Board of Technical Experts. And prior to studying at Cornell, she worked in biology, One Health and conservation medicine, participatory epidemiology, and community-based advocacy in US and East Africa. So Jean, thanks for being here tonight. And whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and take it away. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right, here we go. Let me turn, I think there's closed captions through Zoom, so I'm going to turn the closed captions off there. And yeah, so I'm Jean Coffin-Schmidt, and as was graciously introduced, I'm at my 4th year at Cornell University, and I'm going to be presenting on some of my dissertation research tonight, specifically on the human dimensions of natural resource use and social ecological systems. This research is ongoing. I'm in the middle of data analysis at this time, so constructive critiques, questions, and suggestions are very much welcomed. So what I'm talking about tonight is much related to the picture that you're seeing here. This is a view of the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, New York, on the Niagara River, as seen from a very popular urban fishing site in the Grant Ferry neighborhood of Buffalo, New York. And I'm going to be talking with you about some key findings from thus far from my case study that I've been working on there in Buffalo, New York. And those 3 findings thus far, the study site has a really diverse group of shore-based fishers with an accordingly diverse set of fishing and fish eating practices. It's clear that the fishers are struggling with the tension between the risks of eating locally caught fish and the value they see in those fish and in fishing itself. And so there was some expressed frustration with misfits between what perceived misfits between the policy and the practice of what the fishers are doing. So first I wanted to, let me move that somewhere else. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about the background and the context of how where the case study sits in relationship to other literature. So recreational fishing and the term recreational fishing attempts to be like a big tent for many kinds of fishers. And so it's been defined as such. The Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations uses this definition: fishing of aquatic animals that do not constitute the individual's primary resource to meet basic nutritional needs and are not generally sold or otherwise traded on export, domestic, or black markets. But in the literature, there is a growing recognition that this big tent strategy may be flattening our ideas about what and who recreational fishers are, and that it may be showing up in management decisions. Practically, specifically, there's concern that by aiming to accommodate sport fishing, many recreational fishers who are not sports fishermen may not be well accommodated by the management strategies or the consumption guidelines. So I wanted to point to you some specific recent literature where other researchers are thinking about this too. Thinking about there's the fact that there's kind of a fuzzy boundary between recreational and subsistence fishing, and that people fish for lots of reasons. For recreation, yes, but also sometimes for nutrition or even for food security. Also for cultural practices and to support their own mental health. So this research is based on this idea that we can try and understand fishers based on what they're trying to get out of their fishing. I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but you can see based on the different colors, there are areas where, say, a conventional fisher is really focused over here, in addition to the center, whereas a fisher that is thinking about food and nutrition is weighted over here. So this is one way we might think about how someone who might be termed a provisioning fisher might have some differences, although they also have some overlap with a conventional recreational fisher. So that's some of the thought behind this idea of like, what is a provisioning fisher? So what we know about this kind of fisher is that, and this is still limited literature that suggests that fishers who engage in these like provisioning fisheries often include vulnerable populations, like lower income groups, immigrants, racialized and ethnic groups, and remote and rural community members, and maybe urban community members too. So what does that mean? Are people actually eating the fish? There is some evidence of that. I'm just cherry picking a couple here to offer. There's more out there, but for example, some of the more recent literature looking at coming out of Wisconsin was seeing much higher levels of fish consumption than was originally planned for. And there are case studies globally that are also suggesting that this happens in many places in inland fisheries around the world, such as the Great Lakes, but not just here in the Great Lakes. So what about the Lake Erie and Ontario regions? Investigators at the State Department of Health in found evidence of contaminants in fishers in Western New York State, specifically looking at licensed anglers and Burmese refugees and immigrants. They found that not only was there really variable levels of fish meal consumption, but there were things like mercury and forever chemicals like PFOS in both groups. So there was evidence that, contaminants are being consumed. And also, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation last year did a creel survey to try and understand, okay, so where is this coming from? And they found that shore angler fishing effort is higher than boat anglers, and that shore anglers are catching a wider variety of species and are not as selective about the species that they're targeting. All right, all this sets the stage for the case study, which is part of a larger study on provisioning fisheries. That is looking around Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And my goals in this are to find out whether provisioning fishers appear to be present and active in this location, again, where you can see the picture there on the Niagara River. Who is fishing in this way in this place? And what are their motivations? And along with that, what are the risks and benefits that they perceive to fishing or to eating locally caught fish? So we chose this location carefully. You've already seen this map tonight, but I wanted to just highlight where specifically the research is happening, which is, where the yellow circle is, the Niagara River area of concern. We wanted to be in an area of concern to address some of our questions. And this one is a binational area of concern. It's about 60 kilometers across the lake from the Toronto and region area of concern. It's also like right in Buffalo. Like if you go across to the other side of the island, you're right in one of the neighborhoods that's, a 20-minute walk from downtown. It's a neighborhood with really high racial and ethnic diversity. And it's easily accessible as an urban fishing site. Also, there is a really popular and long-standing local fishing culture in Buffalo. So we thought this would be an apt location to try to further explore some of the potential gaps between this idea of provisioning fishers and recreational fishers, and also to understand, the answers to the goals of the case study. So here's what we did. We did semi-structured interviews, which means and the interview instrument was me. I was the interviewer, which meant that I was walking up to people and having a conversation, really. I was working alone for the most part, except when I needed translation into Burmese. I did speak with Spanish speakers as well, which is fine. I was able to work with that. I did successfully interview about 9 out of every 10 people I asked, which could have been because I was an unusual person there, because I was very pregnant, and pregnant researchers seemed like they were a fun novelty that people were really interested to talk with me about fishing. I interviewed between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. on all days of the week in May, June, and July of 2022. So who were the people we talked to? It ended up being a very nice, diverse group of people in terms of age and in terms of ethnic and racial identity. There were women and non-binary genders were poorly represented in the fishers that I spoke with. But across ages, all adult age groups were well represented, and as were all of the ethnic groups that we expected to see, given what we knew about who lives in Buffalo based on the US Census information. So the first main result I wanted to talk with you all about is based on, this nice diverse group of fishers, is that we see really diverse regions of why to fish. It's not just for recreation. So let's break it down by group categories as defined by the fishers themselves. So any ethnic and cultural categories I'm using here, or labels, are self-identified by the fishers, as are some of the common species names. I will try to remember to translate them when appropriate, the names of the fish, the species. So Buffalonians, who were mostly Black or white, but not entirely, or who identified as Buffalonians, prioritized or said that their mental health was being strongly supported by fishing, and that was really important to them. Or they said that spending time with nature or getting down to the water was really important to them. Also, a lot of them talked about how important Friday fish fries were to them as part of Buffalo culture. And they targeted fish species that they feel are best for Friday fish fries, especially walleye and perch. And they would build them up over time. They would take them home and freeze them. Meanwhile, the group of Asian people, which was a very ethnically diverse, bucket of people, there were the largest groups within that were Burmese and Bangladeshi, but there were many other Southeast Asians as well. They tended to say that family time, or spending time with family while fishing, was one of the reasons why they would fish, or it reminded them of their family's history or culture. They also pointed out that certain local fish species are similar to culturally preferred species to eat, such as bony fish like sheephead, or the minnows, which are the shiners, actually. And each of those were some of they would also eat, other fish that are considered preferred by many of the other fishers, including walleye, perch, trout, salmon. But they had a long list of species that they considered acceptable. The other large group was the Puerto Riqueños. And for them, they said that fishing and eating fish is really important to their culture. They're fish people, and they tended to prefer their fish to be fresh. So that meant that they tended to eat their fish quickly after catching it instead of saving it for later. And they tended to point out that the affordability of their river fish, and particularly of fresh fish, was really different from the affordability of buying fresh fish from the store. So those are the reasons for fishing, right? So what does that lead to then? What perceptions about the fish and the fishing, and what about their practices of eating, fishing, and consuming the fish? How did that shake out? Again, with the Buffalonians, their perceptions of risk had the biggest variation of any group. Everything from people who thought the river was so toxic they would never ever eat fish out of it, so they'd only ever catch and release, to those who said they had been eating fish out of it for all of their 70 years of life and it had never hurt them, and so they weren't worried about it at all. This group of fishers at times would give away, share, or even sell the fish that they caught in informal settings. The group of Asians, their risk perception seemed like they felt they were unclear on how risky it was, but that they saw other people fishing and were learning from the other fishers, especially the experienced Buffalonians. And so they were happy to go along with that. Again, they would catch and eat many different species and had an unusual usage of the shiner or the minnow population, which did catching them in large enough numbers to process them into like fish paste, for example. And there was some frustration, even conflict, verbal conflict between fishers over that use of what is traditionally, to Buffalonians at least, considered bait fish. And therefore, there were some fishers, particularly those who were Burmese, who preferred to use one end of the island fishing area as opposed to the other, perhaps related to some of that conflict and tension. The Puerto Riqueños, they had a wide variety of risk perceptions as well, and it seemed to depend a little bit on how long they had been around, but they do catch and eat a lot of fish. So they were, in terms of species, were quite selective. Most of them seem to prefer what they call silver bass, which I believe is actually white bass. So all of this leads us to the second main result, which is that the value of fishing is in tension with the risks of eating fish. There's a lot of benefits that people, called upon, from cultural practices to mental health benefits of fishing, that local fish is perceived as very healthy and cheap and tasty. It lets some people honor their family members, especially family members that had passed on, and lets them build community or family bonds. Particularly in Broderick Park, there's local community groups that are working hard to make it a friendly place for fishing. But the same is also true of the Burmese community, building a strong community setting for them, for people within their community at the other end of the island. I also saw that very evidently as well in that place. The risk of contaminants, whether bacterial, toxin, pollutants, the proximity to one of the wastewater treatment plants. There's a lot of frustration and concerns about those risks. Widely held frustration and concern, although, as I said, not universally. So what do? They try to balance between the benefits and the risks, and there are lots of strategies used. I just want to be a little bit more explicit about that. Like I said, some catch and release only, totally not gonna hold on to it. Some said that I follow the public health consumption guidelines assiduously. I look it up, I look up the fish species, I make sure I'm counting how many fish meals per week or per month, I make sure I have the right serving size. Meanwhile, others used more of a rule of thumb, saying like, well, not too much, or I don't eat them too often, or not the big fish. I avoid those ones. But there were other ways that people were selective too. There's a large group of people who said, as long as it's not a bottom feeder, it's fine. And others felt that certain species were particularly dangerous. And most people said they were uncomfortable with fishing in the river whenever there was a rain event that caused wastewater that was untreated to overflow out of the escape valve at the wastewater treatment plant. On the other end of the spectrum, with those who were least concerned perhaps, were those who would just visually inspect the fish, and as long as it looked healthy, they said it was a clean fish and it was healthy to eat. And others who just said, nah, I'll eat anything. So it does seem like, given this diversity of practices and diversity of perceptions, that there is a need for different outreach to groups of fishers. A higher level of inclusivity in fisheries management, specifically in this area, would probably benefit many of the fishers. There's a need for informing managers and fishers on current practices for weighing the risks of fishing and fish consumption, and how to balance that with the other types of fish, like store-bought fish that they're also purchasing. Very few of the fishers demonstrated that they were thinking about balancing the number of fish total, including store-bought, that they were eating in their diet when they considered whether they were at risk for consuming, for example, too much mercury. This study also helps to understand the role of urban fisheries as a way to access fresh, affordable fish for those who need it. And it helps demonstrate the non-economic values of these fisheries. Clearly, there are strong cultural, social, and nutritional values to certain fishers. And it just adds on to evidence from other findings in the literature. Specifically, I want to point out again the work done by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Savadati paper was done by the State Department of Health. So this is just adding more detail to some of the concerns raised by that work done. And I also believe that this indicates that the idea of provisioning fisheries, which we use to structure this entire case study, may be helpful for future research and management. So I wanted to point out that this research is ongoing. Not only is the case study still under analysis, but it's only phase 1 of this larger project. Phase 2 is also ongoing. 2 lake-wide surveys of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, focusing in urban areas, are ongoing. There's assistance actively surveying. And then there's a phase 3, which is upcoming, and in which Toronto is a specific area of interest. In that phase, focus group interviews in the vein of the individual interviews I did, but instead with a group of people to talk over ideas and understand how people understand some of the questions together. So Dr. Wynn asked me to give a plug for local champions for the project. So I'm plugging away on that. And with that, I just wanted to offer some acknowledgements and thanks for welcoming to come and talk about one of the neighboring area of concerns and some research going on there.
Okay, great. Thanks, thanks, Jean. That was excellent. So we have a few minutes for questions here. So I just had a couple. And if anyone else has any questions, just feel free to post them into the Q&A. So just start us off. So you highlighted sort of some of the main results, but I was just wondering if there was any results to you that were particularly surprising, and if so, what would have been the most sort of surprising result that you would have seen?
I think one of the more fascinating things was the different ways that different fishers are using the fish. There were very clear camps, those who were, looking to have some frozen fish in their freezer at all times because they just like to. And they would choose to pick out the fish that they really preferred, whether that was, fish from this place or salmon from one specific fishing site and trout from there. And, some of it's particularly Burmese and Bangladeshi, and especially immigrant and refugee fishers seem to be able to continue their cultural practices using the local fish, which is, it's fantastic for their cultural well-being. And I was surprised to see the level of frustration that led to with other fishers, with their concern about whether their bait fish were being overfished, and they felt like it wasn't adequately being addressed by some of the management groups in the area, even though I knew from other conversations with some of the managers in the area that there have been efforts to address that conflict, but I think it nevertheless is still kind of roiling below the surface. Yeah, and just like the diversity of fish that people are eating was more than anyone told me to expect, or that I saw to expect in the literature.
Great. Thanks. So we've had a couple other questions come in. So one from Rick Portis. So curious, not being familiar with the US, I was wondering if there is readily available documents or publications that the anglers could use to guide them and educate themselves about the contaminant risk. So examples in Ontario, we have the Guide to Eating Freshwater Fish. Is this a question you asked the anglers as part of your study?
That's a great question, Rich. Thank you so much. It gives me a chance to say a little bit more about the hard work that the people of Buffalo are doing and what the state is offering too. The State Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Conservation work together to provide fish consumption guidelines, which are available in some detail online. And by some detail, I mean a lot. There are booklets that are readily available in a bait shop that's just across just like 2 blocks away from this particular fishing site. A lot of fishers use it successfully. A lot of them don't. Whether it's because of the language barrier, which is clearly an issue for some people. And so some of the local organizations have therefore made other efforts to offer, to translate the booklet or versions of it into several different languages: Arabic, Burmese, Spanish, and at least 3 others that I'm not remembering right now. Those are available online and occasionally handed out at fishing sites. But if people struggle to access the internet or don't know where to look for that, or can't read enough English to navigate the website to get to that, they might struggle to access those translated versions. There's also a sign, one sign in Broderick Park, which is one end of the island where I was doing this research, that, it's probably 1.5 meters long by 1 meter wide, that sort of lists all of the fish that people are expected to be catching and trying to eat. But of note, it doesn't include some fish that people are eating. Although I suspect with the most recent Creel survey last year that there may be updates that include minnows, for example.
Okay. And for those documents on safe fish consumption that you meant that exist at Did you notice any correlation between the folks that were aware of those documents and their likelihood to eat fish, if that makes sense? So, I mean, I guess if there was any correlation between if people are aware of what the regulations are and how much fish they can consume and things like that, are they more likely to eat those fish because they're now, I guess, educated on what the safe consumption rates are? Just did you notice any correlation on that or?
I think that this study is, mm, at least in this stage of the analysis, is best suited to describing the different ways that people perceive things. I saw that there were groups of people who were definitely reassured by that, but I think that relationship is modulated by understanding and trust. Obviously, if you don't understand it,
Mhm.
can't do it.
Right.
And there are those who said, well, I just use my eyes and I noticed that like all these Asians are eating tons of fish and they're fine. This is a direct quote.
Mm.
Um, and the there are experienced fishers in the area who feel the responsibility to advise other fishers on like, oh, well, that's where the rule of thumb comes from. It's like, oh, not too much, not too often, not too big, as like the baseline that they're trying to share with other fishers because they felt like, that's easy to translate. Everybody should be able to understand that. And there are some experienced Spanish speaking fishers who are making like a very substantial effort to educate their community, even through like YouTube videos, for example.
Okay. Thanks. And then we had another question from Clyde. Just wondering, during your research, what was the least favorable experience you encountered?
I'm not entirely sure if that's asking for like least favorable in terms of like towards the idea of being researched or towards um, their perception of risk. So I'll answer both. Um, I think in terms of like those who perceived the most risk, but still were choosing to fish, they were choosing to fish for other reasons, right? Mental health, family, to honor a deceased family member, etc. But there were certainly quite a number of people who felt very strongly that like you couldn't pay them to eat the fish out of the river. They just didn't trust it. Um, and then there were others who had been fishing for a really long time who felt like the river had gotten so much cleaner that they really felt much better about eating the fish now compared to when they were a child. So it's really interesting to see like there's strong negative feelings about the river in each of those cases, right? But
Mhm.
the perspective on it is completely opposite given how they think about it. And I mean, of course, there are some fishers who would much prefer to just be left to stare at the river and don't want to talk to anyone, which I understand because it's a beautiful and calming place.
Right. Okay, great. And then we had a message or a question as well from Julie asking, were Indigenous fishers also included?
I talked to whoever was there. I only and whoever was willing to talk to me. And there were most of the days when I was there, I was able to talk to the majority of people who were fishing. And I only met 2 Indigenous persons who were fishers. Um, although their perspectives were they were very different from each other because they were very different types of fishers in terms of age, in terms of how long they had been living, what they were looking for out of fish. So I didn't want to generalize based on so small a group.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, well, thanks again, Jean. So so that is all the time we have for questions. So
Thank you.
again, yeah, thanks for being here tonight and thanks for your
My
great
pleasure.
talks. And so our next presentation tonight showcases a recently written report on the status of the restrictions on fish consumption BUI within Toronto and region area of concern. But before we get into our talk, we wanted to run just a short interactive session in the form of a few poll questions, just to get a sense of what people's current impressions are on consuming fish caught in and around Toronto. So, Tisha, if you don't mind bringing up our first question. So the first question, pretty straightforward. Do you fish in Toronto? So just to be specific about the geographic area we're talking about. So talking about the Toronto Inner Outer Harbor, the Lake Shore, the Lake Ontario shoreline from Etobicoke to Rouge, which are the boundaries of our area of concern, and also within the tributaries of those streams. So we'll give folks a few seconds to answer that. Okay, and I think we can close the polls. Okay, so yeah, about a 70-30-ish splits. Folks that 70 being people that do fish in Toronto. So our next question, if we could bring that up. So compared to other areas in Lake Ontario, do you think that the fish caught in Toronto waters are safe to eat? So again, just in general, just comparatively, do you think fish caught in Toronto are safe to eat? And the answers there, yes, no, or if you're unsure, then you can just indicate that. So we'll give folks a few seconds to answer that. Okay, and I think we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so pretty evenly distributed there. A few, yeah, about 47% saying that yes, compared to other areas in Lake Ontario, I think the fish are safe to eat. So that's great. So we can close that one and bring up our third question. Do you know where to go to access information on safe fish consumption? So 2 answers there, either yes or no, and we'll give folks a few seconds. And we can close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Yeah, so that's great. 66% folks know where to go to find information, so that's great. And then we can bring up our last question here before we get into our talk. So last question, if there were no restrictions on fish consumption, how often would you consume fish harvested from the Toronto area? So if you could eat all the fish that you wanted, how often would you consume them? So a number of options there. And if this question does not apply to you, then you can just click not applicable. So we can close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Excellent. Okay, so pretty even split, except yeah, majority of folks, I guess, not applicable. So thanks everyone for participating in that short round of poll questions. So we will be asking a few other questions following our next talk. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ken Drouillard, for a professor at the School of the Environment at the University of Windsor and researcher affiliated with the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research. Ken's research focuses on aquatic pollution, including mapping and modeling contaminant distribution in water, sediment, and biota, performing assessments of aquatic ecosystem services and best practices for managing Great Lakes and large lake restoration. Ken's research projects have spanned all 5 Laurentian Great Lakes, as well as international projects conducted in the Caribbean, Middle East, China, and Africa. So Ken, thanks for being here tonight. And whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and take it away.
All right, thanks, Don. I will share my screen right now. Hopefully that's up. And I'd like to also acknowledge all of the the technical team members who have contributed to this report, so many of them are in this room here. They include Don Little, who is our host, but with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. We had two people from the Ministry of Environment and Conservation Parks Ontario, that is Nadine Benoit and Dr. Satendra Bavzar. Dr. Bavzar is here online with us as an expert witness or an expert panelist. And then from Environment, Climate and Climate Change Canada, we had Laud Matos, who has recently been replaced by Sandra Koch, representing ECCC. So Sandra is here as part of our expert panel as well. And of course, as Don indicated, I'm from the University of Windsor and also from the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research. So one of those questions, I'm trying to move my screen. One of those questions that Don's little survey was asking is, where do I get information from? And this is just a pointer slide to a couple of really excellent sources of information, particularly within the Toronto region area. At the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan website, you can see on the bottom left corner is the URL there. They have a, on their website, they have a Eat Safe Fish PDF document. And that provides a very good overview of which species are safe to eat, which ones should be avoided, and consumption limits for basically the general population, and then what we call the sensitive population. Sensitive population is women of childbearing age and children under the age of 15. I also want to highlight the Satendras page, the Ontario Guide to Eating Ontario Fish, and that's URL is in the bottom right-hand corner. That is a fantastic resource. It includes an interactive map that you could zero in on the water body that you have. Click on the fish advisory there, and it'll bring up all of the advice for that particular water body. Or you could search by lake name in the search tab there. If we just kind of walk through, of course, can we eat this? Can we eat the fish from the Toronto Harbor and the Toronto region? And the answer is yes, but in moderation, and it depends on the species and the size. This is from that Eat Safe Fish document from the RAP, and it provides about 10 different advisories for commonly consumed fish. And there's 2 advisory sets typically, for the general public in the top, and then the sensitive population in the bottom under each species name. The green shade basically indicates for that size range, you could eat 8 meals per month. So that's 2 meals per week. Those in yellow are basically limited consumption, so up to 4 meals per month typically. And then those in red are do not eat. And very typically, the do not eat advisories are more stringently applied to the sensitive population compared to the general population. Now, I won't go through the whole details of how fish advisories are formulated, but they're based on a standard risk assessment. The Ministry of Environment and Conservation Parks Ontario, they do routine monitoring of fish contaminants, and routinely they monitor about 15 different contaminants in fish. They'll return to that water body every 2 to 4 years, depending on resources and things like pandemics not getting in the way of that normal schedule. Collect fish from that area, measure the contaminants in the fish, and based on the contaminant concentrations, reference that to Health Canada tolerable daily intake levels. So these are thresholds, and based on that, come up with a formulation of how many meals you can safely eat. And those meal categories include no consumption, between 2, 4, 8, 16, and up to 32 meals per month. So Don has already given us a bit of an introduction about the remedial action plan for the Toronto and Region Area of Concern, designated back in 1985. And it consists of about 42 kilometers of Lake Ontario waterfront that includes the Toronto Harbor itself, plus the watersheds for Tobico Creek, Mimico Creek, Humber River, Don River, Highland Creek, and the Rouge River. Initially, as Don indicated, in 1987, 8 out of the 14 sort of standardized IJC, International Joint Commission, beneficial uses were designated as impaired, 3 needing further assessment. And then in 2021, Don had 2023 levels, so a little bit more revised. We've seen some considerable movement. So a number of what was previously deemed impaired are being reassessed as being unimpaired for the Toronto region. So a lot of good news there. Okay, so fish consumption as a beneficial use was deemed impaired, and in its recent reassessment also suggested that it was impaired, or it hasn't changed that level of standing, although a 2016 assessment suggested maybe we needed a little bit further information, but things were looking like they'd improved substantially. So this is a report that sort of builds off of that 2016 assessment. And for many of the Great Lakes areas of concern, the beneficial use of fish consumption restrictions is proven to be a really tricky and challenging beneficial use to address. And there's a number of reasons for them. And, you know, one might sort of say, well, that shouldn't be hard. Are there fish restrictions or are there not fish restrictions? And that really can't be used as a criteria any longer, because essentially, based on how the risk assessments are done, and because they're done so comprehensively throughout Ontario, you'd be challenged to find any lake water body in Ontario without at least one advisory, probably related to mercury and a big fish in that lake. So we can't simply use if there are restrictions in place, then the beneficial use is impaired. We have to go through a more structured assessment in our approach. But there's other number of challenges. Remember, this beneficial use was designated 38 years ago. And in that time, the way in which contaminant fish consumption advisories are generated and formulated have changed quite a bit. And in fact, Health Canada's protective tolerable daily intakes have dropped, become more and more stringent over time as we learned better and new science about how some of these contaminants affect humans. But that makes things kind of tricky, because the chemistry may have not changed in the system, but the advisories there might be more of them and at different size classes, because the benchmarks change. So it's sort of a moving goalpost if you're just looking at fish restriction and the number of fish restrictions, let's say today, between what was there in 1987. Of course, fish advisories are a multiple chemical integrative measure. And you also have to be careful when you're trying to compare reference sites with your area of concern to make sure you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges with respect to the different contaminants. Fish move around. Just because you captured that fish in that water body doesn't mean that fish has spent its whole life there. And in fact, some species of fish move quite prodigiously throughout the waters and outside of the whole region. And, you know, some of the telemetry studies even showed, for example, a couple of common carp that decided to meander from Toronto Harbor all the way to Hamilton Harbor, and then, you know, come back to Toronto Harbor. I guess, you know, they see AOCs as sort of vacation spots. And then finally, and I think which our last presentation uncovered very nicely as a prelude to this, is that public perceptions about fishing, what fish to consume, what fish are safe to eat, what fish are healthy to eat, that varies quite a bit. Some species are, you know, there might be very different species that are sought after in different areas. Trying to get a handle on what is a desired, you know, what is that, you know, that last question that Don had given, if you had no concerns about contaminants, how much fish would you really eat? And then, there are differences in what parts of the fish are consumed, how they're prepared, and so forth. Okay. So when we get through the delisting criteria, the delisting statement that we're using is kind of written in italic scripts here, that consumption advisories for fish of interest in the AOC are unrestricted or no more restrictive than advisories for suitable reference sites, demonstrate fish contamination not different from references, are improving through time, or cannot be improved through additional restoration actions within the AOC. Now, that last one, part of that statement, is a little bit of a qualifier in the sense that, although we're supposed to do the assessment of the beneficial use without reference to the local area per se, ultimately it's the job of the remedial action plan to solve whatever's causing that beneficial use impairment. And one of the things that we have to come to grips with is, if there's nothing within the actual area AOC that's causing that damage, causing that bioaccumulation of toxic stress, then it's probably a regional issue, and it needs to be solved at a broader scale regional issue like the lake-wide management plans, and not area of concern remedial action plans. So in order to tackle this kind of complex delisting statement, we go through on the chart, the flow chart on the left side of the screen, which gives us our tiered assessment framework. And for any given tier, we might satisfy all the conditions for our indicator species and designate the beneficial use as unimpaired, or we may not. So if anyone we satisfy all of the criteria, even if it's just for a subset of species, then at least those species can be considered unimpaired with respect to the beneficial use. However, if we do fail, at least for all of the indicator species and size classes, then we move on to the next tier. And then the next tier is basically, the first tier is just asking, are there advisories in place? And are they more restrictive than the maximum reported consumption of that fish species? In tier 2, if tier 1 fails, we then ask, are the fish consumption restrictions more restrictive than reference areas? And here we're using all of the other general fishing zones in Lake Ontario, excluding the other areas of concern like Niagara River and the Hamilton Harbor. Failing tier 2, we now start going into what we call multiple evidence lines weight of assessment. And here we try to compile different types of data sets. So we first look at the priority contaminants in the fish and ask whether or not those are comparable to the reference sites. And then we look at whether or not there's any temporal trends that are showing, well, the fish contamination might be still higher in the area of concern, but over time they're showing a decrease. And based on that temporal decrease, we can even judge what time we expect those fish to come into alignment with the general reference. And then finally, that last tier is really asking what types of remedial actions have been completed in the AOC that have lowered contamination overall. And is there something else that still needs to be done? Is there evidence, for example, of contaminated sediment hotspots that still need to be dug out, for example, in order to remove the impairment? So we're going to basically go through each of these tiers as we go through. So that first burning question, and again, answered for a different place in our first talk today, was what is being consumed from the Toronto Harbor and the Toronto region in the area of concern. And for this, we used 2 sources of angler surveys. The first one, directed by Don, was completed in 2018 and 2019. And in this survey, they went and placed kiosks of basically a quick survey for sportsmen to fill out at a sportsman show. And they were able over the 2 years to get about 152 respondents. And also answering the question that someone had asked, posted online to the earlier talk, we are told that embedded within this database were some indigenous voices about their preferred fish and catch rates as well. The second source was deriving data from the Ministry of Environment and Conservation Parks Ontario's recreational fishing survey. And this is a much broader scale survey that sent out to licensed anglers throughout Ontario. So there's 30,000 respondents from that 2010 survey, and 12,000 of those respondents were from the GTA area based on their postal code. And we extracted that data and we combined the two data sets together. And we put these species together. These are sort of listed in the highest ranked consumed or captured species, angled species, from the two surveys, but prioritizing the AOC survey itself. So this include bass, and some of these are sort of, because of the way the survey was designed, it lumped some different species together, but bass included smallmouth, largemouth, and rock bass as the top most frequently captured, Chinook and coho salmon, brown trout, brook trout, lake trout, and rainbow trout. Third ranked category, common carp, sunfish, northern pike, yellow perch, brown bullhead, walleye, white sucker, crappie, and then freshwater drum fell below the sort of 1% of respondents marked. So we basically ended up taking the first 12 and excluding freshwater drum on that basis. On the far right category, we have the maximum consumption in terms of meals per month. So in the AOC Sportfish advisories, they asked respondents, what is the maximum number of fish you've consumed? And then we had to sort of get at it in terms of frequency of capture, and taking the highest frequency of captures in the GTA MECP angler surveys. But we see for a number of fish species, the maximum reported fish consumption was about 8 meals per month, which is pretty much in line with what most of Ontario sport anglers consume. About 90% of anglers limit themselves to about 95 meals of fish per year, or about 8 meals per month. And then for a subset of these species, like common carp, the bluegill, pumpkin seed, and bullhead, as well as white sucker, most people indicated that the maximum number of meals per month they consumed of those fish was 4. So a smaller threshold. And again, we used these information to ask that first question. Are there fish restrictions in Toronto Harbor for indicator fish species? We're going to use these as our the top ones above freshwater drum as our indicator species. And are the fish consumption restrictions more restrictive than what would be the maximum consumption rate that anglers are actually consuming, which is on that right corner? So either 4 or 8 meals per month. So this is essentially what one of the advisory tables would look like in the Ontario Guide to Eating Fish. And this is for the sensitive population. That's women of childbearing age and children under the age of 15. And we have basically all of the different species listed as rows here on this table. And then their different sizes, they're different sizes listed as columns. So the first column being the smallest size from 15 to 20 centimeters, and the largest column from being 75 plus. And of course, not all fish species fill out all of those different columns because they have a maximum size. And then you'll see basically numbers highlighted. So we could see for that first column and row for bluegill at the 15 to 20 centimeter size, women and children could eat up to 16 meals per month. So very safe fish to eat at that size range. And all of the advisories that are issued for that species, bluegill, are below its 4 meal per month maximum consumption rate. So we highlight that in green, saying it passes the tier 1 of the beneficial use assessment. Same with brown bullhead. but we'll notice a bunch of fish that are highlighted in red. Okay, and those fail tier 1 because they have advisories more stringent than the maximum meal consumption. So, and if we look at rainbow trout, which is a bit of an oddball fish because it's based on really old data. So the newest records in the Ontario database is from, there's 2 records within the last 20 years. So a lot of that data is based on old data, but nonetheless, that old data was suggesting no consumption of even the smallest fish. So if we put all this together and we set up this, we compiled basically whether it passes or fails tier 1 for the general public and the sensitive public, we see that there are 4 species that pass both populations. These are bluegill sunfish, brown bullhead, pumpkin seed sunfish, and rock bass. But there are 9 species that fail tier 1. In other words, there are advisories that are in place, and they are more restrictive than the maximum amount that has been suggested to be consumed by anglers in the area. So that means we have to now go to tier 2. And in tier 2, we now start to say, okay, let's look at the intensity of advisories for the same species in our AOC against the same species out in reference areas of Lake Ontario. And we're basically using all of the fishing zones in Lake Ontario, except for those that were already designated as areas of concern. And basically what we do is we end up compiling for a given size class of each species, all of the advisories in the reference zones. And we ask that our AOC be at least as good as the median of the restriction present within the reference zones. Okay. So again, this is a sensitive population, and we get to this tier 2. We now find a few more species actually kick out. They pass. These include largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, and yellow perch. Now, what that means is, in these species, again, restrictions are in place. Those restrictions are more restrictive than what the maximum level of consumption reported by sport fishers in the region are. Yet, if we look at the intensity of the advisories in those species in the Toronto region, they're not any more stringent than advisories that we find in Lake Ontario as a whole. But we do get 6 species that fail the tier 2 options. These included common carp, brown trout, rainbow trout, northern pike, walleye, and white sucker. So now we go to tier 3. And in tier 3, we start to compile a whole different series of evidence lines. All of these evidence lines pertain to those sport fish species. And basically, there's 3 major evidence lines that we use. So now, one of the things I kind of highlighted to you a little bit earlier is that for some species, there's not a lot of new data. And in fact, what those advisories issued are based on old data, in some cases more than 20 years old. So we wanted to look at recomputing a virtual advisory based on the priority contaminants and restricting ourselves to just data records from 2015 to 2020. And then in that case, if there wasn't enough records, then we would extend that to 2009. But all of the data basically between 10 and 11 years old as recent, and then compare that to our references. The second evidence line was to actually look at contaminant levels in fish, particularly mercury and PCBs, which are the priority contaminants in the area of concern. And for the same species and size class, we basically ask, are the actual priority contaminant concentrations differ? And then the third evidence line is to look at evidence for temporal decline. So the fact that contaminants are dropping with year. So this was basically, again, a check on virtual advisories. This is not the official advisories. This is just us basically recomputing those advisories using the same methodology that MECP does, but restricting ourselves to no more than 11 years of data. And here, for this first one, brown trout passes, common carp passes. That was a surprise for us because it was a tricky one for 2016, but new data was generated. And because of that new data generated by MECP, we were able to pass. Northern pike passes, walleye passes, but we fail for white sucker. And you'll notice that we fail only for the largest size class. In this case, fish that are greater than 55 centimeters in size. We also compared concentrations, and these are, some scatter plots, but basically the way, we're looking at concentration on the y-axis, body size on the x-axis at the bottom. And then the two lines there, the black line represents the data fit to the reference sites, and the red line represents the data fit to the AOC. So where the red line is far above the black line, then we can say there's an issue. But where the red line is low or within the sort of the scatter of points present in the reference, then we say it isn't an issue. So in the case of our brown trout, basically pass for mercury, but for the largest size, you can see that there's sort of two outliers that kind of fall out of the scatter point. But most of the large data set falls within the realm of the Lake Ontario reference. For common carp, passes for mercury and PCVs. Northern pike passes for mercury, and it passes for PCVs. In fact, the mercury in northern pike, which is a highly philopatric fish, that means they don't swim large distances, and most of those are resident. The mercury was lower in northern pike compared to other areas in Lake Ontario. Walleye again passed this, and we have a failure for PCVs. And if I direct your attention to that lowest scatter plot on the right side of the screen at the very bottom, you can see a number of red dots exceeding the cloud of black open circles, but it's mainly for the large size, and that basically only happened after 40 centimeters in size. In terms of temporal trends, we had some data across multiple species, and for all of those species that we have data, they all suggested that they were passing. Even for white sucker, which tended to fail for PCVs, the temporal trend suggested that the PCV concentrations would be similar to reference within the next 10 years. So in very short time. So we start to put together, we start to put together a decision support matrix, which highlights basically if we have more than 2 out of 3 that pass in the category, we say it passes this tier 3. And that was the case for brown trout, common carp, northern pike, and walleye. Rainbow trout, it proved it was too difficult for us to get information on. Wasn't enough records to actually scope it out. And we also later learned that in terms of fish residency status, rainbow trout are really just transient species to the area of concern. So perhaps not the best indicators fish species for this system. But we do get consistent failure of white sucker or PCVs, but not for mercury. And the white sucker have higher PCVs in the larger size classes. So typically between 40 centimeters up to 55 centimeters. So we had to fail tier 3, although most species, except for the largest white sucker, passed tier 3. So we then move on to tier 4 and generate new evidence lines looking at sediment contamination with time, restoration actions completed in the AOC, what's happening with the minnows, the forage fish, the smaller fish that the sport fish are consuming, and what's happening with fish movements through telemetry surveys conducted by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So I realized that there's a lot of text here. But in terms of sediment chemistry, Toronto Harbor sediment chemistry is on par with most of Lake Ontario, but it's a little bit higher than what we would call the nearshore areas of Lake Ontario references. A comprehensive survey completed not too long ago examined 25 stations within Toronto Harbor for sediment chemistry. All of the contaminants were within the realm of the CCME guidelines. The 2 sites that were very localized within the harbor did fail a probable effect level, but 2 out of 25 stations is pretty good, and the general mean was commensurate with Lake Ontario as a whole. In terms of restoration actions, there's a substantial remediation and cleanup activities performed at Etobicoke Creek in 2014 and 2015. And the follow-up studies, that was due to PCBs, and the follow-up studies showed a lot of encouraging declines, immediate declines in forage fish concentrations at the downstream areas of the remediation action sites. And apart from a few stations, sediment contamination in Etobicoke Creek is generally commensurate with Toronto Harbor and Lake Ontario as a whole. In terms of forage fish, most of the forage fish were showing declines in time in their PCB concentrations and mercury throughout the tributaries. Most of the forage fish are collected as in the tributaries as opposed to in the harbor. But there was higher PCBs observed in some forage fish from around the Clairville Reservoir of Humboldt River and the G. Ross Lord Reservoir of the Don River. And there's some thinking that it may even be some of the dam materials, some of the sealants used as part of the dams that may be responsible about that. But as you look at forage fish concentrations further downstreams, moving towards the harbor itself, the PCBs tend to drop. In Humboldt Harbor, PCBs at the river mouth were pretty much in line with what we see at the other tributaries. Unfortunately, we still do not have PCBs and forage fish from the Don River mouth, but that's something that should perhaps be collected. But essentially, we felt that this was partially supportive of delisting. And then finally, we started to look at the telemetry profiles. So different fish are tagged with telemetry receivers, different species, and you have to catch a number of these fish. And then receivers are placed out in the Toronto Harbor, and when the fish swim within a certain proximity to those receivers, it records their location. And they have a telemetry network throughout the Great Lakes now, through GLaToS. Basically, those telemetry networks will provide information even for long-range swimming activity of tagged fish. Now, it is expensive to tag fish. It's difficult. You have to surgically implant the tags. So that limits how many fish you can usually tag in a given study. But among the surveys conducted by DFO, northern pike and largemouth bass are considered mostly resident species. They mostly live within the AOC boundaries. A highly transient species, those that move outside of the AOC waters, included common carp and walleye. I already discussed the tale of the carp who decided to take a vacation in Hamilton Harbor. And then a number of white suckers were found to move in and out of Toronto Harbor. So there is some debate about how much white sucker movement is happening. But we also know that they may be found in the vicinity of the Don River outflow during spawning. So we do suggest that additional, and DFO concurred that additional telemetry work on white sucker be performed. So we tended to suggest that our overall weight of evidence supports delisting, but there should be some follow-up work to be done. And in particular, the one species that kind of failed all 3 tiers was the white sucker, and that was the largest size class as a white sucker, over 40 centimeters. So we really think that it would be useful to figure out through additional, targeted angler surveys and other matters, to find out, who is eating and targeting white sucker from the AOC. Are they eating fish as large as, 40 centimeters in size, and how often are they eating them? And then finally, we recommend that DFO complete some additional telemetry surveys of white sucker so we can get a better handle on their spatial movements. But overall, our recommendation is to designate that fish consumption restriction for the Toronto region and area as unimpaired. So just some conclusions here. Our tiered assessment was used to basically evaluate the beneficial use within the area of concern. Initially, we had 12 sportfish species. 11 of those 12 species passed either tiers 1, 2, or 3, but white sucker failed. And it was white sucker greater than 40 centimeters in size that failed. And we recommend delisting, but also some follow-up information to get some better specific on who is eating white sucker, what size, how often, and where are the white suckers moving around. With that, I'll close the presentation. Thank you.
Hey, great. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Ken, for that great talk. We have a couple questions that have come in for you. First question from Stephen. Are rainbow trout found commonly in other areas nearby, or is this or is the population declining in general?
Well, I can't really talk too much about the population size, but rainbow trout are a cool water fish species, and they tend to prefer water temperatures that are cooler and towards the sort of the thermocline of the lake during the summer seasons. The Toronto Harbor and its tributaries will be too warm for them to occupy, so their residency status is for this window of time when those fish are moving from the lake into the harbors, usually during the spring and late fall. So it's a short residence time, but I'll ask if any of our panel members, Don, you might even be able to answer the question about the rainbow trout status.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm not 100% sure. I haven't been in the field in a long time or looked at that, but yeah, I'm not sure if rainbow trout specific are declining. But again, so Stephen, I know you asked that question, but again, you can reach out to me directly. I can look into that, like reach out to a few folks and things like that, and I can if you reach out to me directly, then yeah, I can look into that for you for sure and try to track down that information.
Don's got all the fish guys in his pocket, so
it's right in my pocket, yeah. And another question came in for you, Ken, from Dave Clark. So you kind of addressed this a little bit in your last slide there with the follow-up actions, but new data for some species is needed, as you mentioned. Will these studies be done in the near future?
that's the hope. And thanks for the question. Yeah, that's definitely the hope. And in fact, DFO completed those studies, I think in 2020, around that area. And in that report, they sort of suggested that, follow-up actions is something that they would like to do. So we're hoping that our report will reinforce that because it becomes tied to a remedial action plan action. And then, the fish monitoring program headed up by Dr. Bavzar, that's going to continue to go on. I don't know when the next schedule of Toronto sampling is going to take place, but perhaps it will be within another 2 to 3 years, but I'll let Satendra answer that. And then Don, the angling survey is up to you. So
Well,
I don't know what you see.
Yeah, well, I wanted to mention too that so in the your one slide you had mentioned where the data had come from, and you'd mentioned the kiosk at the Sportsman Show, which we certainly did collect information there from. But we also did a lot of the data that you would have seen, Ken, that came from us. It also came from 2 years worth of angler surveys that we did in 2018 and 2019 that came from along the waterfront that our staff collected. There's kind of more of an access points throughout our area of concern. So it was a bit more comprehensive than just the Sportsman Show, but we certainly did do that kiosk and yeah, but a lot of the data that you would have seen came from those surveys as well. And I see Satindra has come on here. So Satindra, I'm not sure if you wanted to address that and say when the next survey will be. Oh, you're muted, Satindra, sorry.
There's always something that we miss. Well, first of all, thank you for the question, David. Nice to hear from you. Just a couple of general points here. Whenever we collect samples, like we try to do a very comprehensive collection, it's not always possible. We work very closely with TRCA and MNRF as well as DFO. So, when, the fellow colleagues are working in the area doing their own work, we request samples. And so, it's a collaborative and collective effort that helps us in generating the data that's required for this type of assessments, as well as, of course, issuing fish consumption advisories in general. While this question was asked, I was checking few things, and it seems like we have already collected white sucker from the area. So maybe we can touch base, what was the last sample date that was incorporated in the assessment? But we have collected some more samples over the last couple of years. So we may have something that's necessary for the next step in the assessment.
Excellent.
Thanks, Satindra. And I just wanted to Rick Portis put in the Q&A there that TRCA is sampling next week and they'd be happy to collect for the ministry. And then also on the line of white sucker, Dave Clark also put in there that fishing in the Humber River and Don River for white sucker. So every year for the last 20 years, the fishers taking white sucker home to eat. So just a note there.
Good.
And then I think we'll do one more because there is sort of another interactive session that I want to get to, and I want to also explain a little bit about our prize draw contest. So, another question from Clyde here. So, would you say that the tiered assessment framework is foolproof? So, is there any? I'm just wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
There's no foolproof assessment, but I think the tiered framework, it just helps us organize data to answer very specific questions, as opposed to trying to answer everything, all at once. So really, the framework is just a sort of a guide. And when you get into things like tier 3 and tier 4, you're trying to basically compile a whole bunch of pieces of data and evidence, not all of it necessarily directed towards this endeavor, but try and piecemeal that interpretation into what is happening with the system overall. So, from that perspective, the tier 4 really kind of interesting one, have the agencies done their due diligence in trying to perform cleanup? And we've seen that there's some really good solid evidence of remedial actions and cleanup actions that have taken place in the past. Is the environment responding? And the answer is yes. We actually see sediment concentrations at a couple of sites in the harbor dropping. We see that sediment concentrations are generally below sediment guidelines, for sediment quality guidelines, and forage fish concentrations from many of the rivers are dropping. And again, when almost all of your indicator species meet those first 3 tiers, except one size class and one species, and you have environment concentrations dropping, and that own species, the contaminant concentrations are dropping, I think we got some good signs that recovery is happening. But is it a bulletproof assessment? That's for you to decide. You're the public.
Okay, thanks, Ken. So there's still just a couple just outstanding questions there, but so Ken, I'm not sure, or Satindra, or subject. Oh, sorry, Ken, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, my number one question usually asked me at these types of information sessions is whether or not I eat fish. And I don't live in the Toronto region. I live in Windsor, but I eat fish from the Detroit River, and I follow
Okay.
Satendra's advice, and I
Nice.
feel perfectly comfortable doing that.
Right on. Right on. Thanks, thanks, Ken. And I'm just wondering, maybe I just want to move on to our interactive session here to end things off. So maybe if for the last two questions that are in the Q&A there, maybe if Ken or our subject matter experts just don't mind typing answers to those. And thanks again, Ken, for your great talk and for that assessment. So we now want to continue our interactive session and ask just a few more questions now, now that we've heard about the status of fish consumption in Toronto. So Tisha, if you don't mind bringing up our next poll question. Okay, so same question that we asked prior to Ken's talk. So based on what you've just heard, compared to other areas in Lake Ontario, do you think the fish caught in Toronto waters are safe to eat? So we'll give folks about 5 seconds or so to answer that. Okay, and I think we're good to close the polls there. Okay, so certainly more yeses. I'm trying to think back to what the original was, but I think it was just a little over half was our yeses in the previous question. So that's great. And so our next question. How do you prefer to receive fishing related information from government agencies? So things like regulations, places to fish, consumption advisories, things like that. And there's a number of options there for you. And if this question is not applicable, then yeah, you can indicate that. So give a few more seconds for folks to respond. Okay, and I think we're good to close the poll. Okay, so online interactive maps, the winner there. And so our last question, just before we wrap things up tonight. Do you agree with the report recommendations to change the status of the restrictions on fish consumption, beneficial use impairment in a Toronto and region area of concern from impaired to not impaired? And 3 choices for you there. So we'll give folks a few seconds just to think about that and to respond. Okay, I think we're good to close the polls there. Okay, great. And 72% yes. So that's excellent. So thanks again, Ken, and thanks for everyone for participating in that interactive session. So we do want to continue to get your feedback on this report. So following tonight, you should receive a follow-up email, which will include a link to a short questionnaire, which we will be using to capture your additional comments and feedback and provide you with the method for explaining, for example, maybe why you think the fish in Toronto are not safe to eat. And as an incentive to submit this questionnaire, I will be giving folks the option of having their name entered into a prize draw to win a $150 Cabela's Bass Pro gift card, as I mentioned in my introduction. So the terms and conditions of this contest will be provided in the follow-up email, as well as a summary of the assessment report, which you've just seen tonight for folks to reference while they're completing the questionnaire. And please note that folks who wish to be entered into the prize draw contest, you'll have until November 3rd at 5 p.m. to submit this questionnaire. And following this date, a name will randomly be selected, and that person will receive the $150 gift card prize, subject to the terms and conditions. So if anyone has any questions related to the prize draw or anything that you have heard tonight, or any questions that you thought of afterwards, you can email me directly at don.little@trca.ca. And just to end the evening off, I just wanted to thank again our presenters. So thank you, Jean. Thank you, Ken, for your great talks. Thanks again as well to our subject matter experts for providing your responses to a lot of those questions. And thanks to Tisha as well for helping me organize this event and for doing a lot of work sort of behind the scenes. And thanks to all of you tonight for participating. Your participation and your responses to these questions and everything is really, really very much appreciated. So thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, a recording of tonight's event, it will be posted on the News and Events tab of our RAP website. So with that, I will just say thanks again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Don.
Thanks.